Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tibet Museum. We organize Tibet Awareness Talk twice a month. Today we have Mr. Thubten Samphel, who will give a talk on Tibetan Outreach to Chinese. Mr. Thubten Samphel is currently the director of Tibet Policy Institute, a research center of the Central Tibetan Administration. He was the secretary of the Department of Information and International Relations from 1999 to 2012 and also served as the spokesperson for Central Tibetan Administration. He completed his high school from Dr. Graham's home, Kalimpong. He studied BA and MA in history from St. Stephen College, Delhi University. He was among the first group of Tibetan Fulbright scholars to study in the United States and earned a degree in journalism University in New York. He was a member of the last fact-finding mission to visit in Tibet in 1985. He has written extensively on Tibet in Indian and international newspapers and journals. He is the author of Falling Through the Roof, a work of fiction, and co-author of the Dalai Lamas of Tibet. Now I request Mr. Thubten Samphel to begin his talk.
Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for attending this talk and thank you for your interest in Tibet. The topic of my talk is based on our efforts to reach out to the ordinary Chinese scholars, writers, in an attempt to amplify our voice amongst the Chinese community outside of China as well as within China. Since our struggle is non-violent, we have no alternative except to reach out to the Chinese and explain the nature of our struggle. This effort to this reach out to the Chinese started way back in the late 1990s, late 1970s, when Mao Zedong passed away, and he was succeeded by Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping felt that the previous policies under Mao took China on the road to disaster, and he reversed that. So the focus of Deng Xiaoping's policy was to revive the Chinese economy, and in order to do that, he realized that China should be open. It should import Western technology, technical know-how from the West. So as part of this policy, he sent thousands of the brightest and best of Chinese students abroad. And His Holiness thought that this was an opportunity for the Tibetan refugees to contact the Chinese students and explain the nature of our struggle. So at the time, the Chinese students, understandably, felt that what the Tibetan refugees were talking about was something which had a vested interest. The Tibetan refugees had a vested interest in painting China in very bad light. So the response wasn't that positive. But later on, their attitude changed because of two events. One was in the late 1980s, Lhasa erupted in protests. The other event, and this protest was suppressed by the Chinese authorities. for the first time in the history of the People's Republic of China, martial law was imposed. Early on, in no other city was martial law imposed. So the first martial law which was imposed in the People's Republic of China was in Lhasa during the time of Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao, as you know, was the predecessor to Xi Jinping, who is now the president of China. So, and the other event which took place was the Tiananmen Square democracy movement, which took place in 1989. And that the Tiananmen Square democracy movement was suppressed, and with force and with tanks. So when this, thousands of Chinese students were massacred by the Chinese authorities. When the Tiananmen Square, this movement was suppressed, Chinese students or those who were living abroad felt that if the Chinese government was capable of killing its own children, students, then there must be a great deal of truth in what the Tibetan refugees have been talking about all these years. So this realization that their government did not discriminate between Tibetans and Chinese in a way brought the Chinese dissident community closer to the Tibetan refugees. And this resulted in a series of what we call Sino-Tibetan dialogue conferences, where we Tibetans explained the nature of our struggle to the Chinese students, the conditions in Tibet. So what's the main message of the Tibetans to the Chinese? This message is articulated by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and the message is that the Tibetan struggle is neither anti-Chinese nor anti-China, that the Tibetan struggle is pro-justice and a resistance against oppression. The Tibetan struggle is an effort by the Tibetan people to protest the wrong policies the Chinese government is implementing in Tibet. So apart from criticizing the Chinese government against its wrong policies, what do the Tibetan people really want? How do we see a just solution to the issue of Tibet? And this is encapsulated in what we call the middle way approach. The middle way approach is a demand by the Tibetan people for genuine, meaningful autonomy within the scope of the Chinese constitution. And we also wish to have a single administration for the whole of 6 million Tibetan people. Right now, the policy pursued by the Chinese government is a policy which is very akin to the policy of divide and rule practiced by the British government during the British Raj here in India. Tibet is divided into so many units. So our demand is that all the 6 million Tibetan people should come under one single administration, and this administration must enjoy genuine autonomy. Right now, the policy pursued by the Chinese government is that every administrative, political decisions for Tibet are made from Beijing. There is no autonomy at all. The other event which in a way facilitated or made our effort to reach out to the Chinese more urgent was the 2008 protests, peaceful protests which took place throughout Tibet in 2008. And the Chinese government's reaction to these protests. These protests were prolonged, and I think throughout the spring and summer of 2008, there were this protests all over Tibet. And these protests, in a way, preceded the run-up to the Beijing Olympics in August 2008. And the reaction of the Chinese government was that these protests were instigated and manipulated by the Tibetan exiles, and specifically His Holiness the Dalai Lama, or what they call the Dalai clique. And the reaction of the Chinese government was twofold. One was to blame the protests in Tibet, what they called the Dalai clique, and the other was to just use the firepower of this Chinese state media to create ethnic animosity between Chinese and Tibetans. And as a result of this, the Chinese students in China launched what they called the anti-CNN website to expose what they saw as Western media bias in favor of the Tibetan people. So what was the reaction of the Tibetan administration? First of all, I think as I've mentioned, to reach out to the Chinese was made more urgent. So I think after the 2008 protests, whenever His Holiness the Dalai Lama had the opportunity to reach out to the Chinese students abroad, he did that. He went out of his way to explain, he made an effort, every effort, to meet Chinese students, scholars, writers, and explain to them that the Tibetan struggle is not anti-China, nor anti-Chinese. At one point during the heat of this animosity between, or misunderstanding between Tibetans and Chinese, at one point His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, either in New York or Boston, he invited some Chinese students to his hotel and explained to them what the unhappiness of the Tibetan people in Tibet is with the wrong policies implemented by the Chinese government. There was no effort by either the Tibetan refugee community or His Holiness the Dalai Lama to provoke hostility between Tibetans and Chinese. So at one time His Holiness said that at that time the sort of anchor of the Chinese students was so strong that luckily there was a long table between His Holiness and the Chinese students. Otherwise, he said, he would have come to physical harm. So the one effort which we made was to appoint liaison officers to those Tibetans who spoke Chinese, to explain the nature of the Tibetan struggle to the Chinese communities. So there was liaison officers to reach out to the Chinese communities in New York, now in Washington DC, in Australia, which has a large Chinese scholarly community, and one in Geneva to reach out to the Chinese scholarly communities in Europe. and also to explain to them that that we are the Tibetan struggle, the focus or the goal of the Tibetan struggle is not to seek independence, but rather to achieve genuine autonomy within the scope of the Chinese constitution. So how did the Chinese, so what's the result of our effort? In China itself, the liberal section of the Chinese public within China, they reacted very positively. After the 2008 protests, helped by Liu Xiaobao. Liu Xiaobao was the winner of the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize. Right now he's in prison. So led by him, they started an open letter to the Chinese government. This letter is called the 12 Suggestions for Dealing with the Tibetan Situation. And this letter, if you Google search 12 suggestions for dealing with the Tibetan situation, you can access the whole document. So this open letter was issued and made public in March 2008. And the essence of this letter was an appeal to the Chinese government, saying that the Chinese government should resist from using the enormous power of this media to create hostility between Chinese and Tibetans. The letter also said this letter was initially signed by 300 Chinese scholars, writers, public intellectuals within China. Later on, this letter was signed by, I think, more than 1,000 Chinese, concerned Chinese public figures within China as well as outside of China. So this letter, as I mentioned, said they supported the peaceful efforts by His Holiness the Dalai Lama to resolve the issue of Tibet through this dialogue between Dharamsala and Beijing. The other gesture in support of the Tibetan effort was called the Gongming Tibet report. This report was made public in 2009. It was initiated by the Open Constitution center based in Beijing. Now this NGO it was closed down by the Chinese government. So ever since the 2008 protests took place, and the immediate reaction of the Chinese government was that these protests were instigated by the Tibetan refugees and specifically by the Dalai clique. So the purpose of the report was to find out the reasons for Tibetan discontent, and they sent 3 researchers to central Tibet, to northeastern Tibet and eastern Tibet to find out what are the causes of Tibetan unhappiness and discontent. So the report eventually said that the Tibetans were unhappy that there was no outside force instigating the Tibetans to rebel or protest against the Chinese government. Tibetan unhappiness resulted in the wrong policies implemented by the Chinese government, and I think the report eventually had many recommendations, and the first recommendation to the Chinese government was that any future policy meant for Tibet must be based on the hopes and aspirations of the Tibetan people. And if you are interested, this report is also available on the internet. If you just search for Gongming Tibet report, you'll get the whole report. And the other important effort, this was a tweeting between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and young educated Chinese in China. This took place in 2010. It was initiated by Wang Lixiong. Wang Lixiong is a Chinese scholar based in Beijing. He is married to a really tireless Tibetan blogger and poet called Wei Se. They live in Beijing. So this is a conversation between, it's a video conference organized by Wang Lixiong, a conversation between 2 or 3 human rights lawyers based in China and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So these 3 lawyers had a lot of concerns about the nature of the Tibetan struggle, and they had a lot of questions. So these questions were put forward to His Holiness, and His Holiness responded. So many of their concerns are concerns which are very similar to the concerns which we Tibetan people have. Will the Tibetan struggle remain non-violent? Who will succeed His Holiness when he is no longer with us? Will the Tibetan struggle turn violent when there is, in the absence of the calming effect of His Holiness the Dalai Lama? So as I've said, this conversation between Chinese lawyers in China and His Holiness the Dalai Lama here in Dharamsala took place into July 2010. So the tweeting between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and I think there were thousands of questions put forward to His Holiness, and Wang Lixiong through this Google managed to select the 10 best questions, and the Chinese netizens also voted for the 10 best questions to be answered by His Holiness. So I think there are two conflicting views on the effort by the Tibetans and the Central Tibetan Administration to do outreach to the Chinese community. One response is one of skepticism, and this skepticism is expressed by this European officials who are in a way interested in a speedy resolution to the issue of Tibet. So several European officials said this effort will not bear fruit, that there are this 1.3 billion Chinese, and best of luck to your effort to make the Chinese understanding of this effort. The other attitude is best expressed by someone called Yu Jie. He's a public official who used to be based in China, but later on he asylum in the United States. So he told Radio Free Asia that this attempt by the Tibetans to engage the Chinese in a conversation on the nature of the Tibetan struggle is very beneficial. Right now, the Chinese public is brainwashed by the propaganda churned out by the Chinese government. If this, he said, this effort compared to the volume of Chinese population is small, but if it's if the effort is continued, this will destroy all the propaganda imposed on the Chinese public by the Chinese government, and if this effort continues, it will just somehow reveal to the Chinese, ordinary Chinese, the truth about the Tibetan situation and the nature of the Tibetan struggle. So he, in a way, encouraged we Tibetans to continue with this dialogue and conversation. So I've gone through this, and I think this is the end of my talk. And the other point I would like to briefly touch on is the attraction of young, educated Chinese to Tibetan Buddhism. We believe there are about 500 million Buddhists in China, and most of them are attracted to Tibetan Buddhism. So we feel this our sort of effort to start a conversation with the Chinese public on the political on the issue of Tibet, and the Chinese public's attraction to Tibetan Buddhism in a way will result in creating, if not resolving the issue of Tibet, this in creating mutual respect, this better understanding between the Chinese people and Tibetans. Whenever His Holiness gives teachings, these days there are many young educated Chinese who attend his teachings here in Dharamsala and elsewhere in India. So we feel Chinese attraction to Tibetan Buddhism in a way will soften the Chinese people's attitude to the political cause of Tibet. And thank you so much for your attention and your interest. So if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them.
In New York, this Chinese group called Falun Gong, if you heard of it.
Yes.
Yeah, so they were protesting against China, and they were giving pamphlets. So I asked them, do you support, you are against Chinese atrocities, do you support Tibetan autonomy? But they were not that much interested that time. So are those groups fighting China within Chinese atrocities are making common cause with Tibetans?
And also our attitude to Falun Gong is that ambivalent. The reason is that the reason is explained by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The fact that they've been oppressed and there's organ harvesting in China is something which should be condemned. But at the same time, this Falun Gong is basically it's an effort by the practitioners to be much more healthier human being. So this sort of thinking is in a way propped up by a mixture of Taoism, Confucianism, and this Buddhism. So this kind of mixing this different philosophies to make yourself better is something which His Holiness feels is not right. If it's Confucianism, the integrity of that philosophy should be maintained. If it's thousands integrity should be maintained. So I think our sort of ambivalence is against this mixture. But we deeply sympathize this this oppression of Falun Gong practitioners in China.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I asked them. Like, you are also oppressed by Chinese government.
Right.
Tibetans are also oppressed. So you should
But apart from Falun Gong, I mean, there is deep empathy between the Chinese human rights, this community. I mean, there is this, this conversation and mutual support. And we also empathize with the Chinese government, practices in Xinjiang, and with the people, certainly with the people of those who support, advocate democracy in Hong Kong, and also our sympathy and support lies with this people of Taiwan. Earlier on, we had what we called I forget the name of the title, but anyway, there was an attempt by His Holiness the Dalai Lama to bring all those who suffer under Chinese oppression as one under one roof. So there were Manchus, people from Inner Mongolia, people from Uyghurs from Xinjiang, Tibetans, to make a common cause to bring our struggle to the attention of the international community. Anyone else? Please.
Hi, I'm sorry, I think I missed the first 5 minutes or so of your presentation. So there's an organized Chinese outreach program, correct? You have people on social media.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. On all and then also there is Radio Free Asia, or Radio
Yes.
Free Asia Tibetan, and I understand there are also Tibetan youth that learn Chinese language, and they're on social media, like they have sort of chat pals.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and they're making friendships and communicating with Chinese
Yes.
in China. Okay, and also there are some Chinese that at least like they just left. I believe there's a contingent that comes every year, a few groups of them. There must be some kind of interpersonal contact program with those Chinese that come here to Dharamsala.
Yes. But many of those who come to Dharamsala, I think they just sort of focus on their spiritual well-being.
Okay.
They are in a way because of Big Brother watching them. They want this sort of enter territories which are political. So at the same time, there are some Tibetan NGOs who are dedicated to starting a conversation with the young Chinese in China. There's an organization called Dewa. Dewa means contact, or here in Dharamsala. So there, I think there's about 8 of them. Those who speak, read, and write Chinese. So their aim is to draw the attention of the young Chinese to the issue of Tibet. So they feel that directly, starting a conversation on the issue of Tibet somehow, this shocks the their Chinese counterparts. So they start conversation by, in a way, I mean, the sort of the style is to just find common ground, and many young Chinese, they are totally disgusted with corruption that is just prevalent in China. So after they sort of start or establish some degree of mutual trust, then they veer the conversation to the issue of Tibet and conditions in Tibet.
Yeah.
And at the same time, with the Department of Information and International Relations, they have a China desk. There they maintain a website, and the purpose of the website, it's in Chinese, is to draw Chinese attention on the issue of Tibet and to explain our the struggle, that it is not anti-Chinese, no anti-China, it's pro-justice, something which every Chinese deserves and should fight for.
Suppose I were, all these things are great, but suppose I were a Chinese living in Nanjing or Beijing or something, would I be able to access that website?
No.
Yeah.
They created this great firewall of China,
Right.
which is to isolate ordinary this Chinese from the information on any issue,
Yes.
which is I think more sophisticated this internet users have
Yes.
ways and means to jump over the firewall and retrieve information which is really disapproved by the government.
So it's still, as you said in your presentation, it's still a fairly elite group of a few thousand, maybe let's say, I don't know, what, 100,000, 10,000 something? People who are really...
I can't give a number,
You can't, can you? With this
but at the same time, I mean, I think that the internet and the freedom which the internet grants to everyone in the world, it's looked upon with great nervousness by the Chinese government. Because of this, they have started what they call this 10-cent army. Those who are paid
Yes.
by the Chinese
Yes.
government to steer conversation to non-political
Yes.
or to this anyway to
There are other groups
steer the
also.
conversation away from anything politically sensitive or damaging to the Chinese
They're
government.
basically paid trolls.
Yes.
Internet trolls that are
Right.
paid. They come on, I believe Russia also has them. They come on into any conversation and they make little comments.
Yes,
and
yes.
they try to
And the sheer volume of their this sort of onslaught drowns out any
Yes, yes. And then people
any
just
topic.
give up and quit the conversation
Yes.
and yeah, so, oh, I see. Thank you.
So in continuation is this, do they have religious freedom in China then? Because you said a couple of people are Buddhist and most of them are not Muslims, not following Buddhism. So
No,
there is no
I think
religious freedom, right?
the way the Chinese Communist Party looks at any religion is how useful that particular religion is to the sort of stability of the party. So the Chinese Communist Party won't let religion go out of their control. So I mean there is a degree of religious freedom, but that freedom is controlled and monitored.
Why I'm asking is because of lot of students who come to America, they have no religion in China, but when they come to US, they adopt Christianism right away. So I was like wondering,
That's
there
their
won't
choice.
be any, there
Right.
won't be any religious freedom in China at all.
But I think one of the fastest growing religion in China is Christianity, followed by Buddhism. But as I've said, religion is in a way seen as an asset. Those who are religious, wherever there's a religious group, there's less crime. So the party sees as an
As an
asset.
yeah.
But they won't give total religious freedom, because then it will this sort of freedom will be used against the legitimacy of the
So it
party.
must be monitored also.
Monitored, right. Please.
Why did the Tibetans actually go to Dharamsala? Why this place? Was there always living a lot of Tibetans in Dharamsala or Meklotganj before all the Tibetans had to flee? Or is
No,
it
when we
escape?
first came to exile, we were the guests of the government of India. So the government of India decided that this chose Dharamsala as this residence of His Holiness Dalai Lama. So it's a choice made by the government of India. So because His Holiness is here, a lot of the Tibetans flock to Dharamsala. Yes, please.
Between the Chinese and Tibetans in exile and the Tibetan government, CTA.
Right.
But what I read was that there's a lot of indoctrination done to young Tibetans living in Tibet by the Chinese. And earlier, even Tibetan parents would be afraid to discuss issues concerning Tibet to their children. So, do these dialogues also concern Tibetans living in Tibet who may be indoctrinated by the Chinese?
No, I think the purpose of the whole dialogue, which started from 1979 and ran to 2010, was to resolve this issue of Tibet. So we have just presented to successive Chinese governments our this main demand that the whole of Tibet should come under single administration. And this administration should be autonomously governed and administered by Tibetans in Tibet. So this is the whole point.
Are Tibetans living in Tibet also Tibetan students have a distorted view of the Tibetan struggle?
No.
Indoctrination by the Chinese in schools?
I think there's this Tibetan habit of resisting any Chinese this influence. So many of in fact after the 2008 protests, there's a rejuvenation of the Tibetan spirit. There's this pride in being Tibetan and concern that our identity should be preserved. So there's a new, fresh awakening of the realization of the value of Tibetan culture and our identity.
And so another thing is that you mentioned that Christianity is the fastest growing religion in Tibet, followed by Buddhism. How come Christianity, sir?
I think it's sort of as a result of this huge transformation China is undergoing. Right now, communism, socialism, all these isms are all but in name. China is this sort of the Chinese Communist Party is operating a hugely successful form of capitalism. So because of this, there is a deep sort of a spiritual emptiness within young Chinese. Today, socialism is good, this communism is good. Tomorrow, everything is, even I think Chinese Communist Party doesn't believe in communism. So because of this, there's this need for young, educated Chinese to make sense of their place in China, and so it's sort of a spiritual.
So how are they drawn to Christianity rather than Buddhism?
This I wouldn't know, but I think Christianity is a powerful force, and I think maybe I'm sort of reading this. Sort of my reading might be wrong. So Christianity is identified with the West, model for development, model for society. I might be wrong, but
UN has no role to play, right?
What's it?
UN doesn't have any role to play in this.
UN. Oh no. I mean, China has
Bit of
this
a-
enormous
But then
economic
in
clout.
Asia there is no organization which can address this issue in a bigger scale.
Oh no.
No?
China is in a way, I mean, because of its enormous economic, this weight it carries around the world, no one can influence or this pressure China on any issue at the moment.
It could change.
It could change. Right, please.
And it's similar to the previous question, my previous question. A few weeks back, there was a Chinese contingent, mainland Chinese, Han-Chinese contingent that were here in McLeod.
Ah, yes.
They were meeting with His Holiness personally. They all seemed really happy to be here. Now, what would be the risks for a Chinese visitor to Dharamsala like that? For them, when they go back, are there spies among them watching? Do they have any repercussions when they return? Do you know anything about that?
Till now, I haven't heard any Chinese individual coming to Dharamsala, receiving teachings from His Holiness, having a bad experience in back home.
Right. Okay. I just wondered, like, 'cause surely.
But I think they are also, very careful. Once when I was at the Department of Information and International Relations, His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 2012 gave the Kala Chakra teachings in Bodh Gaya. So there was more than 1,000 Chinese from China, and they were all given the best location.
Yes.
So I remember whenever this cameras were hovering around, they always just hit their face. So they're very careful.
I wondered that because I also actually wanted to speak with them and ask them questions, but I was afraid it would compromise them somehow, or they would be afraid if I did. So
Right.
I just decided to ask other people like you. Thank you.
Because it's a huge universal risk for them.
Yes, I would think so.
I mean, the Chinese government portrays His Holiness as a wolf in a monk's robe,
Rose, right.
and this kind of name calling makes ordinary Chinese who have great deal of respect for His Holiness to be very, very careful that their dealings with him is not made known to the Chinese government.
So you went on a fact-finding mission to Tibet.
Right.
So can you tell us in short what you found there?
I was there in 1985. This fact-finding mission was the last one. So we had the opportunity of meeting with the 10th Panchen Lama, Nabu Ngawan Chingmi, and this Baba Phunzo Wongke. Baba Phunzo Wongke was the one who interpreted between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Mao Zedong when His Holiness was in China for a little less than a year, and he had frequent meetings with Mao. So my sort of memory of the visit was the sense of how strong the Tibetan spirit was. I mean, during those days, it was direct physical assault on Tibetan culture. Monasteries were destroyed. I mean, at that time there was severe restriction on the practice of religion. So regardless of the physical damage, they underwent, their spirit, both old and young, this Tibetan spirit was very strong, and so that was very, very deeply moving and inspiring. Right then, thank you so much.
So we would like to thank Mr. Thubten Samphel for the very informative talk. So as a token of appreciation from Tibet Museum, we would like to offer Tibetan traditional scarf to him. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
And thanks all for coming. Thank you.